Good day and welcome everyone to this edition of Eyes Front, a Caribbean Newsroom production. We are originating from one of the hot spots in the world right now, Trinidad and Tobago, and welcome. So I want to make the point for at least two of my guests that we are in a very, very sunny location. That is specifically for Dr. Tamanisha John and Professor Isaac Saney, both of whom are in Canada, and my colleague here in Trinidad, Tony Paul. Welcome all. Let me give you, for our viewers and listeners, an introduction to your bio. So Dr. John is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at York University in Toronto, Canada. She studies Caribbean development, sovereignty and politics, as well as Canadian foreign policy, economic imperialism, financial exclusion, and corporate power. Caribbean self-determination, in particular, is among her research interests. She has published in leading peer-reviewed journals, including Class, Race, and Corporate Power, the Review of Radical Political Economy, and Social and Economic Studies. Professor Isaac Saney has a bridge to Trinidad and Tobago. He grew up here, but he now lives in Nova Scotia. He is a Black Studies and Cuba specialist at Dalhousie University and coordinator of the Black and African Diaspora Studies program. He is the author of, among others, several books including Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. And Anthony Paul is an energy policy and strategy advisor whose work is focused on rebalancing oil, natural gas, and mining deals to allow post-colonial countries to retain greater value of the natural resources that they own. His training is in geology and geophysics. In addition to his many other responsibilities, he is the chairman of the Lloyd Best Institute of the Caribbean, from where we actually coming to you today. So welcome all of you to this edition, and I'd like to say that under normal circumstances, this is a day that will be completely focused on making sorrel, punch a creme with plenty of rum, black cake coming out of the oven, a ham smelling, and general music and soca parang, and that's Trinidad. But for some reason, or I should say for reasons that we are all very familiar with, there's a lot more going on, and you have divided attentions, but we've set aside some time today to focus on the issue of the arrival of the United States military in the Caribbean and the implications of that, the actual events surrounding it, the implications, and we've put together this team because of the geopolitical issues involved, and I think Professor Saney and Tamisha and Isaac would be, the leading voices in that for us. And Tony, because Tony he understands and he's very aware of all the issues involving oil and trade and the flows. And so I'd like to start off with Dr. John, Tamisha, for an overview from where you are on the situation in the Caribbean as it involves the U.S. and Venezuela.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tamanisha, and something that I will say is I've been ringing the alarm about the sort of U.S. military and, diplomatic presence in the Caribbean since early 2023, when then U.S. Southcom General Laura Richardson actually pressed the Biden administration to refocus efforts into the Caribbean region. And when she did that, she did it under the guise of combating new competitors like China. And then she also said focusing on some of the older adversaries, in which Venezuela and Nicaragua were specifically named in March of 2023. And then 2023, of course, became an important year because we also saw the end of 2023, Venezuela made the referendum on Essequibo and Guyana, and then that sparked the sort of renewed tensions between Venezuela and Guyana. And then we also had a lot of high-level U.S. Generals and secretaries visiting Guyana at the height of those tensions as well. So, that was under the Biden administration and coming into the Trump administration, where we more forcefully see the Trump administration reassert that there was going to be this renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere, in which the Caribbean would be a focal point of this reassertion. So again, under the Biden administration, we have the Southcom general saying that we need to focus back on the Caribbean to beat out China. Around then, you also had conversations of the U.S. opening 2 new embassies in the Eastern Caribbean specifically. Towards the end of 2023, we have the tensions flaring up between Venezuela and Guyana. And then incoming the Trump administration, where they're saying we need to refocus on the Western Hemisphere and sort of increase our military presence there because of the belief that, Latin America and the Caribbean is their backyard. And in all of this, Venezuela has been in the background, and Venezuela has been in the background since even prior to 2023. During the first Trump administration, they pointed out that they, wanted access to Venezuelan oil. And I think that people have forgotten that. And, that's why they recognize Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela at the time. You also had it where Kamala Prasad-Bisesar, the current prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago, she also was one of the CARICOM or Caribbean leaders that went along with that recognition of Juan Guaido. And so regime change has always been something that the U.S. has wanted to push in Venezuela from the time of Chavez, given the massive oil reserves there. And I think now with this refocusing, this strategy to combat China and the Belt and Road Initiative, and how many Caribbean states have increased, though minimally, trade and business with China, you have this ultra focus now because Venezuela is seen as also the link that China has in the region, precisely because the U.S. has this long history of isolating Venezuela for the Bolivarian Revolution. And so I will leave it there. I hope that I answered the question in a long-winded way, since it's kind of escaping me now. But the U.S. push for regime change is a long project that has only been pushed into our attentions given how drastic they view competition with China in the present, and therefore getting rid of ideological adversaries in the hemisphere.
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting how you lined up the events. As you say, you've been warning about this. It's just a straight line. That comment that you to Trump's comment about, he said it in North Carolina, I think, in the run up to during his campaign, that the second attempt to get into for his second term, about were almost there. We had got to this point, and we would have had all of this oil like for free.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it.
And so it was clear from then oil was on the agenda, and that the whole narco-trafficking thing that has come up later is really a cover. And we had this reference to Southcom, where the now retired General Laura Richardson, I think, she mapped the resources that would become available to the U.S. if they paid more attention.
Why this region matters, with all of its rich resources and rare earth elements. You've got the lithium triangle, which is needed for technology today. 60% of the world's lithium is in the lithium triangle: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. You just have the largest oil reserves, light sweet crude, discovered off of Guyana over a year ago. You have Venezuela's resources as well, with oil, copper, gold. China gets 36% of its food source from this region. We have the Amazon, lungs of the world. We have 31% of the world's fresh water in this region too. It's just off the charts. But then when you talk about trade is unbelievable. The trade in the region, I talked about all the ties that we have with this hemisphere. But the PRC and a lot of our countries in this region is the #1 trade partner, with the United States #2 in most cases, not in most cases, I would say in some cases. However, to see the increase in investment in trade from 2002 from China, 18 billion, up to 450 billion now, and on its way what is predicted to be about 750 billion in the near future. And so I think we have a lot at stake. We have a lot to be grateful for in terms of the relationships with our partner nations and our hemisphere that we're part of, and in the Americas. But we have a lot to do. This region matters. It has a lot to do with national security.
Isaac, you want to pick that up from there?
I mean, the U.S. wants to control the trade routes, the energy corridors. They want to have absolute hegemony within the Americas. It comes out in Trump's national security strategy. It makes it very clear. I mean, there's a lot of debate over this sort of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of continuity with previous logics of U.S. imperialism, and there's obviously a specific stamp that Trump's regime places on this, right? It was Blinken who said that Latin America, this is undermined, that Latin America was the front line of the struggle against China, right? And it was very early on, even under Obama, you had to pivot to Asia, where they recognized that China was going to be the serious challenger to the United States, right? And during the Cold War, we had the logic of the Soviet Union and the East-West thing, but the Soviet Union was never a serious economic competitor with the West, especially the United States. China has emerged as this, right? And so one of the things is that, coming out of this, there's debates, is the U.S. therefore adopting a strategy to retrench itself in Latin America so it can, in a sense, secure its so-called backyard, the lake, the Caribbean lake, in order for it to further challenge China? Some of them over a long time ago were predicting imminent clashes within the next 5 to 10 years militarily with China, okay? Or is this an acceptance of a tripolar world and the U.S. trying to at least preserve some of its dominance and so on, right? But then there's questions around the issue of the U.S. dollar and reserve currency, right? Will it be the reserve currency of the world, right? Will all the major commodities, right, still continue? I mean, I think 70% of the world's commodities are traded in U.S. dollars, right? Will that be challenged and so forth? And then one of the fundamental things is the role of international law. So, I'm a historian. My PhD is in history and so forth, but I also have a law degree, and I had a focus in international law. And I talk a lot with international lawyers, extremely prominent in the field, right? And one of the things we talk about is, does international law still exist? Does it only exist in theory, right? The United States has not only, without any, not that it would be legal, but any sanction from the United States, from the United Nations Security Council, is seizing these tankers, which is against the convention of the law of the sea conventions, right? Okay, it's completely illegal. And does this mean that international law no longer exists? We witnessed it with the genocide in Gaza, right? The international law was floated, right? We see it with the genocides in Sudan and also in Congo, right? And now we see the United States, seizing these tankers. And Trump just said, I think this morning, right, or last night, that we either will keep the oil or we will sell it. It's outright theft that they're now legitimizing and so on, right? So there's some very significant dangers here, right? And when it comes to the Caribbean, the Caribbean islands are under significant threat and pressure. So I have no doubt that it's not shall we say unreasonable to expect certain governments to actually cave in when you face those kind of intense pressures. But what's really surprising, particularly when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately, is it's one thing to succumb and cave into these immense pressures, right? It's another thing to gleefully and enthusiastically join this imperial project, right? Trump has spoken about it and makes it very clear. There's a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, right? And this is not only about economic control, as Tamanisha pointed out, it's about crushing any sort of ideological and political alternatives, right? And many of us are thinking, there's a debate, is Rubio driving this, right? Okay, and so forth. But it's really part and parcel of what personality is involved. I would argue the logic of the U.S. drive in terms of now as it begins to decline as an imperial power. And one of the questions people often argue is also this directly aimed particularly at Cuba, right? Okay, Cuba has specifically been for over 65 years the unforgivable revolution, such as the Haitian Revolution was the unforgivable revolution. The example of an alternative, but the example also of resistance to U.S. dominance, right? So is Cuba the next one on the list and so forth? But I think we're living in a very dangerous time. And the last point I'd like to make, as someone who's believed in Caribbean unity, believed in the Caribbean project, from the realistic position that, being small countries in the world, often dismissed as microstates, our strength lies in unity, right? Okay. And this attempt to fragment the Caribbean, right? To dislocate, if not destroy CARICOM, to actually reduce it to simply being a tool under U.S. domination is extremely dangerous. And I think of a number of things when it comes to climate change. How will we deal with climate change? If we put all of our, shall we say, confidence in a country such as the United States and a regime such as the Trump regime that not only denies climate change, but ultimately undermines all the climate change accords that have been thing. What about Petro-Carib, right? As much as it's been weakened, right? What does this mean for some of these all the smaller Caribbean islands, right? And I could go on and go on, right? And so once again, the most thoroughly colonized space in the world, which is the Caribbean, right? Okay. Now once again finds itself afoul of these imperial contradictions and so forth. And it's clear that the people who believe that the elites in the Caribbean who actually believe that somehow they will benefit or the island will benefit, they might create that narrative. They have confused proximity to power with actual power itself. And when you have a regime that has basically denigrated and degraded countries of the South, who's referred to them, I won't use the expletive on the show, right? But he's referred to them in the most degraded ways. How can we expect him to actually give any value to us and so on, right? So I think these are extremely dangerous times. And, the flouting of international law, the reduction of the Caribbean once again to being attempt to reduce us to simply being pawns, right? Once again, firmly under U.S. domination, I think does not bode well for the future. But I also believe, I always think one has to be optimistic, right? Okay. And I believe there are also movements that are developing, right? Popular movements, hopefully, that will, in a sense, acquire the strength and the power, right, to push back against what I think are very dangerous developments.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's moments like these that help to show you to what extent the progressive movements have. Where they are in terms of their strength. This is the moment that people declare themselves. And but Tony, do you think that the energy sector in the Caribbean even considers the geopolitical environment in which they operate? Because we've been, we have this relationship going on for a long time with Venezuela. Venezuela has sold its oil on concessionary terms to several countries in the Caribbean. I think Jamaica, for example, has loans totaling like about 1 billion US. Well, I'm not sure if it's billion, if it's US. I think it should be at a rate of 1%. And did we even see any of this when? Until the warships arrived in the Caribbean in terms of our relationship with Venezuela.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for those 2 points from 2 previous speakers. Very, very enlightening. And as we can tell from that, there's a lot of pieces moving in this puzzle. And I'd like to throw a couple more into the room when you started the one there, Sunity. And I think we have to think about the pieces and then see how they fit together on where to focus our energies in trying to get to a solution to the situation. Now, as you've said, Venezuela, as we all know, Venezuela has the most crude oil in the world, right? Now, people belittle that and say it's heavy crude. It is to a large extent. But guess what? Every single refinery in the United States was built and designed to process heavier crude. The United States, at the moment, is exporting and producing more crude than they can use, but this shale oil is a light oil. That's not suitable to get the end products these refineries were designed to make. In other words, they can't make the diesel and the gasoline at the price American consumers are willing to pay. To produce shale oil, the price for a barrel must be at least $50. If it isn't, then half of production shuts down of shale oil. In addition to that, You won't get product from refineries at the prices Americans are accustomed to. So because of that, heavy oil producers, which America used to be until shale oil came along, heavy oil producers are in demand. And the Middle East oil is light oil. The big heavy oil producer that America bought from was Venezuela. And when they sanctioned Venezuela, guess where they went to? Russia. So the three big heavy oil producers can provide cheap oil to America are Russia, Venezuela, and Canada. Canada's taking up some of that slack, but most of that Canadian oil is out on the West Coast. And that pipeline to bring oil to the States has run into a lot of problems over the years, and it can't come through. America today, under all these sanctions, still imports over 200,000 barrels of oil from Venezuela every day. Right? So in spite of all these sanctions, they still need Venezuelan crude to keep gasoline and diesel prices down. So much of American industry and commerce runs on trucks and diesel. That's not going to change in a hurry. So many Americans move by car and gasoline. And one of the biggest bellwethers, as we know, for American economy performance is the price of gasoline at the pump. So that has to stay down. And that is one of the reasons that heavy oil is so important to the American economy. And that's part of the picture. But this is not the first time American warships have come to the Caribbean, is it? The last time they came, the big time they came, they were invited. And you know why they were invited? To protect our oil. Between the First and the Second World War, Winston Churchill famously said, the First World War was run on coal. The Second World War will be run on oil. And it was. And that's why the Russians moved on Baku in Azerbaijan to seize their oil fields. And that's why Germans sent so many U-boats to Trinidad. Because Trinidad, during the Second World War, had the biggest refinery in the British Empire. And there are more German U-boats sunk off the coast of Trinidad than in the entire Atlantic. And that's why the Americans were given the base at Chaguaramas to build a naval base to keep their submarines to protect the tankers taking fuel to Europe for the war. So we've been in that place before. But the question I've heard nobody ask about is, what will the Third World War be fought on? All the ships, all the planes, all the tankers, except for a few nuclear aircraft carriers or submarines, all still run on petroleum. Are we facing a big war? Look what happened when the war on Gaza. What did the Houthis try to do? Starve Israel of fuel. What is the war in Ukraine and Russia? What are they targeting? Energy sources, fuel, refineries. Without oil, you can't fight a war for a long time. Is somebody preparing for a war and saying, let me prevent somebody else getting oil and let me keep control of it? And is that part of the equation? Yeah, so that, to me, if I see this kind of pressure for oil, I see two fronts: the home economic front for the US and the idea of who will win a war. Right now, China, as we know, has been taking a lot of Venezuelan crude, and Venezuela has had to import naphtha, which is a light petroleum product, to blend with their heavy crudes to get it to export, to get it to move through their pipelines, for instance. So that two-way trade of product is an important one for Venezuela's production. And part of the blockade might be to prevent naphtha coming in from those places. Ultimately, if this war were to end with a change in government in Venezuela and America taking control of access to the oil fields, I can see potentially a lot of that light oil that America is producing from the shale oil being redirected to Venezuela to blend with the heavy crude to get a crude that can then be transported more easily so that they get more value. That light oil isn't making a lot of money in domestic refineries, but it might make money partnering with heavy Venezuelan. So there's economics around that to be worked out. But we have to think more deeply about the politics of oil. Because this is about oil, ultimately, Yeah. And if we just stick to the controlling for what purpose, what is the end game? And I think that's part of the equation. And of course, China plays a big part, because who is the next big war lining up to be against? Yeah. Right? Who is making threats or making motions as if there is to be a military intervention or conflagration with China? So that I think is something that I haven't heard people talk about, but it's something that comes to my mind as somebody who studies oil and has seen the oil history of Trinidad and seen how these things work out. You know, we all know from back in the 70s the impact of conflict on the price of oil, right? So we studied the impact of the price of oil on conflict, the access to oil and conflict.
Yeah. So
those are my thoughts there, Sunity.
Yeah. I think that naphtha is, doesn't it come from Cuba? And
no. I mean, it comes from oil, so it comes from different places. I mean, Iran sent some over.
Okay, the shipments were coming from Cuba because when they blocked it the other day, they picked it up or some from there.
Yeah.
And but I think that there's definitely a race that is on for somebody to win. We can see, not just in the strategy, but the security strategy that has come out of Washington, but in the decisions and actions of the U.S. in particular. There is an idea of the world, of a tripolar world in which the U.S. is dominant. There is a pulling back a bit from Taiwan. In other words, China, you can deal with that area. They're not that interested in Ukraine. Putin can take that. But we are the superpower, a world in which there's one superpower. And that, I think the race is really about AI. Because China is ahead on electric vehicles, far ahead, and on robots. They are preparing to virtually flood the world within a few years with robots. And the price is coming down, I mean, from 200,000, they foresee it to come down to 20 and even lower. In the US, a lot of these data centers, the US has found itself, and this is the nature of the relationship between the tech moguls or the tech bros and Washington. And what Trump is doing, from what I see, is he is just facilitating their requirements. They have convinced him that the AI frontier is a whole new world. It is even more important than the Industrial Revolution. It is a total reconstruction of the world, the global system, the economy, the age of abundance. AI is going to produce constant 24/7. The cost of everything is going to fall. People are talking about a universal basic income because you will lose the jobs, yes, but you shall use AI, become an entrepreneur. And if that doesn't happen, because in the first instance, massive job losses are predicted, give you a universal basic income because all these things, the cost of production is so low because of the high level of production. But what America does not have is the energy that is required to get ahead in AI. And China is right on its heels with that from what they're saying. And to clear that path, you don't have the solar. They don't have the solar. They don't have the nuclear ready. They don't have the electricity. But the thing that is immediately available while other things are going on, like trying to put up some stations in outer space and so on, the thing that you have to use now and is available and they want it now is oil. They see that nuclear and other forms of energy are important, but too long. It's not going to the pace at which China is moving. And what China has done is they have quietly tied up a lot of the resources in terms of natural resources in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America. So I think that is really where the race is at, and there's a whole framework that the U.S. is putting together, including the crypto, a whole new, financial system, all of which is to facilitate what they consider to be the next frontier. Tamanisha.
So I before anything escapes us, I still want people to understand that sort of who controls global finance is still firmly dominated within the sort of Western hemisphere. When people talk about China as a competitor, China is not this big financial competitor to the United States. And I think that when we mislead people on that, then people's expectations of China are frequently underwhelmed when China doesn't intervene. But when you look at sort of the global financial landscape, China only registers as a blip. The issue, or the US issue with China, or the West issue with China, is that China has escaped the trap of dependency by not being reliant on the West. After the 2007-2008 financial crisis, China looked to improving its middle class to, help to create a bigger consumer base for itself within itself, and then started making these connections with other countries abroad in Africa, also in Asia, in Latin America, the Caribbean, to do trade with, so that in the event that the Western bloc took a hit, as it did during the Great Recession, China could somewhat be protected in terms of still being able to trade with other actors. And it is the fact that China is not dependent on sort of the Western trading landscape that worries the West, because that means that China can then have a unique development path. And so what the US is afraid of or worried about is China's political, ideological way of development that could then encourage other states to not be as reliant on this Western bloc as a reserve currency or even as a trading partner. The second thing I want to note, just because both Isaac and Tony also mentioned it, is that as the U.S. is doing all of these aggressive tactics towards Venezuela, the U.S. is also intervening in Ecuador. It's still trying to intervene in Honduras and in El Salvador. And we also see that the U.S. is intentionally worsening the energy crisis in Cuba. So what do I mean by this? The first Venezuelan oil tanker that they seized was not seized in any international waters. It was seized on its way to Cuba because they did not want Cuba to get access to Venezuelan oil. And when I pointed this out, people thought it was some conspiracy. But 2 days ago, Republican Rep. Carlos Jimenez, who works very closely with Marco Rubio, he tweeted out saying that he's going to end trade relations with Mexico if they don't stop sending oil to the communist dictator in Cuba. And so they were condemning the fact that Mexico and Cuba were engaged in trade, and part of that trade included oil going to Cuba. So they have a stake in worsening the energy crisis in Cuba, because they hope that by worsening that crisis, people will get upset, and they always want regime change in Cuba, right? And then the third thing I want to highlight, which is why I even started looking at the U.S. military 2 years ago, warning this, is that the U.S. is not retreating militarily. The U.S. is retreating based on tactics. So what this means is that the U.S. is removing itself from conflicts that would appear as if U.S. boots on the ground would be necessary. The U.S. has no problem droning people or sending in any sort of other technological ways of killing in any part of the world outside of conflicts that, Russia is engaged in, for instance. But the U.S. is trying to not get into direct confrontation. And so the U.S. is not pulling out from Taiwan. The U.S. does not ever want a situation where it has to send U.S. boots to Taiwan. And that is why in just this year alone, the U.S. has sent Taiwan over $2 billion worth of arms packages. They are hoping that people in Taiwan fight or confront China in some way, but for U.S. boots to not be there. The U.S. military base architecture is global. It's global. Even though the U.S. says that we want to focus more on the Western Hemisphere, this has not meant that the U.S. has shut down its bases on the African continent or in Asia or in any of other these places. They may be taking away some personnel, but it's still keeping its military stranglehold around the world. What it is trying to do is cut off China from accessing resources that could continue to aid its own development. And I think that we have to make that very clear, because what the U.S. is threatened by with China is not China as some bigger economic competitor, but it is threatened by the fact of Chinese development that is not dependent on the United States and the Western countries.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add to that, Sunita, just like I said, this on the question of China. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, there were huge debates, right, in so many different, I remember reading it on the left, but so many different journals, about whether China was a branch plant of Western capital, right, okay? And they become an independent pool of capital accumulation, for want of a better term, right? And so they have defied, as Tamanisha pointed out, the idea of becoming subordinate to Western capital. But I also want to go back to this. I mean, when we get to the Trump national security strategy, and, you know, I was watching an interview with Blinken and Fareed Zakira on CNN. You know, I try not to watch this sort of stuff. I find it very hard to stomach, but they were doing this interview. And, you know, Blinken said normally these national security strategies are released and nobody reads it, right? And he made a comment that never have so many worked so hard on the documents that so few would read. But the Trump one has received a significant amount of interest and so forth. Everybody's dissecting it and so forth. But, and, you know, so people are trying to see discontinuities. But there's also, as Tamanisha was pointing out, this is a question of difference of tactics, not strategy, right? And there are continuities between this strategy and the project for the new American century, which all of us, in the run-up to the American invasion, U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, read with, you know, tremendous alacrity and concern, right? Okay, about preserving U.S. dominance on a world scale. And what we're seeing is that in the U.S. ruling circles, there are debates, right, over how to ensure U.S. imperial dominance, right? Does it mean retrenching and first solidifying our base in our hemisphere? Okay, or does it mean engaging in multiple attempts across the world? This is a difference in tactics, not in strategy, not in fundamental aim. But I want to get back to your point too, and this is a point I make about AI that I make with my students. And, you know, in academia, there was sort of like an existential crisis about AI. You know, how would you police it? You know, how would you ensure that people weren't writing all of their essays by AI and so on? So I talked to my students about two things. One, about, you know, academic integrity, but I also mentioned the fact that AI itself is going to be one of the tremendous drivers of ecological collapse, right? Because it demands so much energy, right? So much energy, right? I understand that in California, they're building separate power plants just to fund these AI developments and so on. And, you know, talking about, you know, you see what Trump is planning in terms of doing with the Arctic, for Arctic exploration and so forth, for oil and so forth. So the control of energy, right, has always been central to imperialism, right? You know, so it's not just about the war for oil, it's about controlling the energy sources, as Tamanisha and Tony have pointed out, of your competitors and so forth. And at the end of the day, you know, I think, you know, ultimately, right, you know, we're facing very dangerous times because, you know, the U.S. is determined to ensure, and the West is determined to ensure that it does not, right, in a sense, decline as the imperial hegemon. And in fact, you know, it's interesting that if you read the national security document, there's a lot of discussion about the European Union as well, right? Which is seen as a rival, and the European Union itself must be discombobulated, if not disintegrated, to make each of those states a vassal state of the United States and so forth. So the contradictions, right, are rife, dangerous, and explosive. And when we come back to the Caribbean, okay, I think when you see international law being shredded as is, what other moral protection do we have but international law? As small, not very powerful states, as microstates, as the degrading term makes us out to be. So the shredding of international law, right, is really one of the most frightening things we've seen. I mean, as limited as it was, right, as much as it was a colonial and imperial construct, in the 60s and the 70s, people, and even in the 80s, you know, the Global South was able to carve out of international law very important concessions to issues of self-determination and development. And now all of that is being rolled back, right? So it's almost as if we're in a flight back to the worst of the 19th, 18th, and 17th centuries.
Yeah, Isaac, we also have to add to those resources that the battle includes is water.
Yeah,
right?
water as well.
There are communities in Latin America that had to go to court to stop Google. And they're looking for sources of water outside of the states. Right?
There's a famous documentary on Cochabamba, right, many years ago, right, when Bechtel tried to, basically privatize the water falling from the skies.
Yeah, but I want to bring back the conversation to what is in the Caribbean here, because Tamanisha made the point of where the seizure of the vessel occurred. We are constantly told these things are in international waters. Where in the Caribbean is international waters? I can't comprehend it. And so it allows the different countries to say, well, I don't have to get involved. It's not in my waters. But if it is in your waters, how do you even know? How does a population find out, except there is some element in the regional framework that can tell them? Unless you see the point about the drones, you really don't need a base, a physical base. We have a radar system in Tobago that can capture the information, communicate it to wherever the surveillance system is, and the one where you give the direction, okay, bomb that particular point. That's all you need. You don't need like Chaguaramas to say, well, we need the peninsula, which was the 1940s. And in fact, the last period of invasion in the Caribbean really was Grenada. And we have the continuing story of Haiti. Haiti is, in today's world, it is under regime change all the time, one president after another, and we've had successive U.S. administrations determine who is the president, right? Who is going to be the president? This one would win, and they would say, no, we prefer, Sweet Mickey, and you install Sweet Mickey. And that has been going on, and the Haitians are not getting a chance to have the space because of all the importation of the guns and who is arming these gangs and so on. So, but these things are occurring in the Caribbean in the periphery of our consciousness. And we know what happened in Grenada. One of the differences between 1983 and today is that Reagan arranged to ask to be invited to come, because one assumed that you can't just jump in and into a country. So I think it was St. Lucia and Dominica from the OECS that would offer the invitation as a pretext to come in. In this case, there was no discussion. There was not even the pretext of a discussion. And what we are seeing here is complete bilateral. Countries are talking and entering bilateral discussions without reference to their own regional organization. When Marco Rubio first, after he became Secretary of State, and his first engagement with the Caribbean was to go to Jamaica to meet the Prime Minister of Jamaica at his office, and other leaders were invited to come and meet him at the U.S. Embassy, one by one. Nobody said, we have a regional organization called CARICOM, and we will meet you as CARICOM. And now what we are seeing is the immediate threat to CARICOM. Now we have gone into these bilateral relations in terms of the agreements that we have, some of the agreements. We are also seeing, I think Tamanisha made that point, all over the region, while those battleships are in the Caribbean Sea, which is a presence, in my view, it brings to your mind immediately American power, supremacy, military supremacy. And in that environment, there are a host of discussions going on. Belize signed something recently, third country safety, where it's an outpost for asylum seekers. They would, you want to seek asylum, you go to Belize, you make your application and you wait. You can come from anywhere in the world. That is where you're going. You're actually sent. You have countries with prisoners. This one is asylum seekers. So what is the future for a region that is as fractured? The pressures on CARICOM, the internal war that is going on, the quarreling that is going on right now, Mr. Jimenez actually came out and said he supported the position taken by Kamla Persad-Bissessar, and to give her weight, to add weight onto her side. How do countries like our little island stand up without a larger body of people, a regional organization, not just CARICOM, but we have CELAC, which involves Latin America and the Caribbean. But these things are marginalized because we really have never been able to get these organizations to act as one. At every stage, we have certain governments that will absent themselves, that will vote against, and not deliver the unanimity. How do you, in the context of a history of fragmentation and division, how do you come to a point of where your very survival can be threatened? Your sovereignty means virtually nothing. How do you move forward? Isn't that a challenge for the moment? Right? Because CARICOM has gone silent because the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister has been so vocal. I think they're afraid if they come out and disagree that the division will become, I mean, it's obviously there, but that it will become more fraught. Yes, Tamanisha?
So it has never been in the interest of, the former colonizers in the Caribbean or the United States for the countries to have a type of regional integration in the Caribbean. I remember almost a decade ago, people were asking this question like, oh, why can't CARICOM be like the European Union? But the European Union was a despised entity by the United States. And so they don't want, deeper Caribbean regional integration or even an African Union. And I think that what we need to recognize in the Caribbean then is it is up to people who live in the region to form regional organizations that would force states' hands to make these regional organizations and this sort of broader unity, because it cannot come from the state. I was talking to someone yesterday and I pointed out that even though Kamala Persad-Bissessar has been attacking CARICOM, people should not hold their breath for sort of CARICOM to respond, because a lot of the CARICOM leaders are part of this comprador class who align with foreign capitalists and who align with imperialists. And if we listen to the teachings of Walter Rodney when he was writing about Tanzania, something that comes through is the fact that you cannot negotiate with comprador classes because they are subservient to foreign capitalists and imperialists, which means that they fundamentally position themselves in opposition to their own national and popular democratic interests. Therefore, the onus of creating the type of unity that we want to see lies amongst the people. And so what ends up happening in the Caribbean is, because we view the comprador classes as the sort of most visible impediments to democracy and progress, individuals from this class are blamed for the ills in society. So KPB is, very critiqued right now, and that allows for the redeeming of a sort of new comprador leader who is also going to frustrate the people. So people point out, well, Raleigh had signed some of these deals and things too, and all of that is true because at the end of the day, they serve these foreign masters. I think that we need regional unity amongst Caribbean people, not necessarily states, because the unity has to come from the people to hold the state accountable. Otherwise, you can't have these top-down structures who by their very nature want to align with imperialism. I pointed out that Kamala has been using, every time she attacks CARICOM, that, Venezuela wanted to invade Guyana. And Guyana has not said anything. It's not that the prime ministers and stuff in Guyana have not seen these statements or have not heard these attacks and, the secretariat or the building is located in Guyana. It's that they agree or they don't want to attack their masters, and that is the United States. In the Caribbean, I always say that none of these states are democratic. All of these states are more beholden to foreign capitalists. There's apartheid that operates throughout the Caribbean, and people say, what do you mean apartheid? And I'm talking about economic apartheid. Foreign capitalists have a different rank in Caribbean societies than Caribbean citizens themselves do. It is easier for them to go and be tourists. It's easier for them to start up businesses and all of these things. They don't have to follow the same laws that Caribbean nationals themselves do within their own countries and societies. And that is by design. And I think that something that helps this sort of regional disunity, even amongst people, is the fact that we don't learn each other's languages in the Caribbean. We say like, we speak English, Dutch, Spanish in the Caribbean, but there is not that cross communication that happens. And that cross communication aids sort of these imperialist divisions that do exist in the Caribbean region. And then also, we don't do a good job of educating citizens about history for them to want to form these organizations, except for when an emergency time like now comes. I tell people all the time, you know, my family's from Guyana and we visit all the time. And I have cousins who call me saying, oh, they have to do a project about race, but they don't know who they should write about because people are not learning about Walter Rodney in Guyana, right? And so political education is severely lacking in the Caribbean, and it is by design, because it is only political education that will inform people that we need these sort of regional mass organizations and to not be dependent on these leaders that don't have our interests in mind.
And, you know, all that you say there has been well documented, and the question is, where is the point of intervention? In terms of, we know this, we know that the barriers that, you know, that were built up by different colonial powers, that are French and Spanish. Language is big, culture is, you know, these are barriers that are enduring. Why has it been so change resistant? And of course, it very much has to do with the leadership class, that is, the education system is totally disconnected. And so you are educated to become part of the system. So, but Tony, you a big part of this discussion in terms of the colonial legacy is really the structure of the economy as well, and how the something like the energy sector, where your work has been about how do you transform those relationships so that countries are not just pay a royalty and a tax, and all the value added is accrued to whoever is exploiting the resource in some other part of the world. I mean, Guyana is going through that big time now. Exxon went into this deal that they're benefiting from. You have the Canadians in the gold mines devastating that part of the country, you know, and so on and so forth. So what is the progress that we have been making in this, in terms of economic transformation?
Yeah. Very little. I mean, because we don't write the textbooks and we just learn somebody else's textbooks and the language they use and the approaches they use and follow them, and we're judged on how well we can replicate what somebody else has said. We use model contracts, laws, licenses that were designed by somebody outside and brought to us without questioning whether they're appropriate for us now. They may have been when they were put in place the early, and my work in Africa, I see this too. Many of the contracts, the laws were written in the 70s and 80s when international companies were now going international and were bringing models and tutors. Our people were keen to learn. So they went up to schools in the metropolis to learn about oil and gas law, license and regulation. And they brought that back. But the textbooks were written by Americans, Europeans, right? And because they're the ones who learned, they then thought about it themselves, the other people, and they kept it. So the work I do, I'm exposing some of the language we use and some of the mindsets they create, and then the outcomes that they generate. And that's why we end up with very little. You know, so for instance, one of the things I always speak about is people tell you shouldn't increase royalty, you should reduce royalty, because royalty is an additional tax, and therefore it makes your venture non-competitive. But all over America, Europe, Australia, Canada, people pay royalty, you know? And in fact, royalty, and put it very simply, is that if somebody wanted to use the vegetables on your land or the coconut trees, harvest them and sell them, and tell you, I will pay you a portion of the profit, which is a tax, you know, like a tax. But then they let their brother pick it, and then they give you an invoice from him for twice the cost of picking a coconut. They use their own trucks to carry to market, and they give you a price for renting the truck, and then they sell it to the market and they give you a price. And then they show you, hey, there's very little profit. But if you said, as the notion of royalty was intended to be, you're removing something that I have and using it to create value for yourself. Pay me for my input. That's what royalty was. And if you cut down a tree of a king or shot a deer, you pay 1/8 of the price in the market. And that's what royalty is supposed to be. Oops, sorry, I thought I'd turn this up. So, but we've been taught and we learn and we preach that royalty is an extra tax, so we move it. You know, Venezuela is much smarter. they kept their royalty, right? We in the Caribbean, because we came on later, Venezuela got independence a long time ago, and they had time to think for themselves. We use these old models, and we do that. So, and that brings me back to the question that Tamanisha put up a map just now about the international space. And what you showed there was different countries in the region and their maritime boundaries. Now, maritime boundaries are two forms. You have a territorial zone, which is 12 nautical miles, in which you have entire control. Then beyond that, you may go to an economic zone, environment zones, which it could be up to 200 miles, depending on your neighbors and your continental shelf. And that's where, under the International Convention for the Law of the Sea, all vessels are allowed what is called innocent passage, except military vessels. So Tamanisha's map is interesting because for military vessels to pass, there must be some kind of protocol. What's interesting is neither the United States nor Venezuela signed on to that treaty. So it means that the United States doesn't sign on to any kind of multipolar treaties. Yeah. So that's what we call international waters. Does need to be interrogated, and I'm happy Tamanisha did it and put that circle on there. Because between Trinidad and Venezuela, there is no international waters. Between Trinidad and the north coast of Venezuela, there is no international waters for 12 miles out. So that's an interesting point. But so it comes back to the point I'm making. We take in news from news sources in the same way we took concepts in education from other sources. And we're doing our own interrogation. So people are telling us these ships are shot in international waters. Chinese were killed, right? Did we say, let's find satellite data and the companies who provide this data and get a picture of where that ship was shot and geolocate it? That can be done. But we have 2 nationals killed. And did our government do that? Well, obviously not, right? But how about the Colombians and the Venezuelans? Are they doing that? So there are ways we can find things, but it comes back to, again, the reference to Walter Rodney and to Lloyd Best. We have to think for ourselves. And that's the only way we find solutions to these problems. But unfortunately, we are consumers of news and opinions.
But we seem to accept a balance of power against us, which is we don't seem to feel that we are entitled to ask for this information. And neither of these governments that signed these agreements will speak about it, including the one who is outside of office and would love to take on the government, is taking on the government. But if you say, tell us what, no, there's silence, because one must presume that there is some non-disclosure agreement of some kind, or how easily we went into those things. So this comes out of not just our own idea of what is logical in an agreement, but the lack of self-confidence, the sense that we have to be nice, right? And that it's in this environment where we have not invested enough into, from the ground up, integration. Right? Remember, we started with a federation that was a British concept. I mean, they're leaving and they really don't want to have to deal with so many islands. The federation was a convenient. The federation was not a ground up. That was replaced in due course, where the Treaty of Chaguaramas is purely about trading relations within the region. The investment in the integration of people has not been made. It's not there right now. There are people on the side of a truly regional space, but how is that to be leveraged? Or is it not enough to leverage in this situation to block certain things? Isaac, you want to comment?
I'm just thinking about it. I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I think, the issue is, and I was having a conversation with a colleague who's actually from St. Lucia, who teaches with me at Dalhousie University, and we were talking about CARICOM, right? Its limitations, right? And this as a moment to radically re-envision CARICOM, right? From the bottom up, right? Sort of a popular democratic project rooted in the people. I think, as you know, CARICOM has often been, technocratic, slow, elitist, right? Incapable of getting things done quite often, right? How do we do this? But CARICOM itself, by even its existence now in its current form, is important, right? Okay, because it provides a platform, right? If it disintegrates, what does it leave for this kind of unity that we're talking about across the islands? I really think, getting back to the education question, I have friends and colleagues, who are part of the University of West Indies system in the 70s and 80s, right? Particularly 70s. And there was a radical discourse, and you didn't have to agree with everything that took place, right? People had a vision, right? And it's interesting to see that doesn't exist anymore, right? Because I don't think, as Tamanisha was pointing out, the corporate elites want to have a conscientized and educated masses of people who can challenge, right, the dominant narrative, right? Now, what that means to reinserting that in today's context, I don't know how we go about doing that, right? But I think, we need a new vision of pan-Caribbean unity. And I remember the conversations I had with the late, great Norman Gervan, right? And he spent a considerable amount of time up in Nova Scotia. And I had for about just over a decade coming up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and teaching various courses in the fall. And I remember having serious conversations about Pan-Caribbean unity, right? How do we build it, right? Okay. Is CARICOM the structure that can do that? Okay. Is CARICOM necessarily, because of the way it's so state-centric, an antithesis to the popular democratic movements that we really need to really authentically establish projects of self-determination, right, that can truly challenge imperial might? I think this is the goal. And I think when we go back, and you mentioned in passing what happened in 1983, the Caribbean left, the progressive, has never recovered from what happened in 1983. Okay, and I think that's an important point. The idea of now once again having to rekindle and rebuild that movement among generations, a young generation who aren't scarred by the memories of what happened in 1983, right? I think is one of the tasks that we face, right? And how we build those moments, I don't know. But there are a lot of young people from, and I talk with a lot of my colleagues who are much younger than me, who say there's among the youth, there is this new impetus that's developing and so forth, right? And so on. Whether it can survive with the rapacity that we're seeing from U.S. imperialism, I don't know, right? Okay, nothing is written in the stars, right? And unfortunately, endings that happily ever, people lived happily ever after often don't happen, right? So I think these are long struggles, and we need to have a reinvigoration, right, of the progressive left rooted in the people, right? And this perhaps can provide a moment. And Walter Rodney has been mentioned, Lloyd Best has been mentioned. There's a whole number of luminary Caribbean intellectuals, right? Okay, that have been forgotten, right, and being marginalized, right? And we can go back and we can repurpose their thinking for the 21st century. But that's a lot of work. That's nitty-gritty work, right? It's not something that happens with a magic wand. It requires organizing among people and so forth. And then, of course, when you have a society that's suffused with the visions of what a good life is supposed to be coming from the West, right? It becomes very difficult to do that among the masses and so on. Last point I'd like to make, which is going back to this issue of war and how it's, I think, when we look at the United States as well, as it's going to be spent, I mean, it's like, for example, keeping, apparently it's costing the U.S. $18 million a day just to keep the military in the Caribbean, right? Carrying on these attacks on these ships and so forth, right? And so the U.S. and then Trump just acknowledged, the Trump regime just says, the Congress just voted over $1 trillion budget, the largest military budget, right, ever for the U.S. military. So where is this coming from? I mean, this is coming from side by side and deeply connected to a campaign of austerity, right, within the United States as well, right? So even within the United States, we're seeing popular resistance to what's unfolding, right? Popular resistance to the obviously very overt policies of the Trump administrations, but tremendous opposition to the austerity that's emerging and so forth. So I always like to say that I don't know how these interventions that the U.S. is carrying on is unfolding. Its attempt to bring about and place a different government in power in Venezuela. But I always say nobody can predict the future, but there's always a law of unintended consequences, right? And this may have very dangerous negative repercussions for the world, but it also may actually lead to accelerating the further decline of U.S. imperialism.
So is it that we have to depend on the law of unintended consequences in this case?
Yeah.
Tamanisha?
I just also want to add that I've seen so many people try to equate any sort of U.S. confrontation with what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan or any of those things. And I think that people forget that Venezuela is a much larger piece of territory. Venezuela also had a revolution where military loyalties are with that revolution. And Venezuela is also located in a region where frequent U.S. interventions have made it so that there are guerrilla groups that exist. And many of those guerrilla groups have released statements saying that we would go and fight to support Venezuela. And so any type of U.S. intervention in Venezuela that, again, would call for U.S. boots on the ground will be completely detrimental to the United States. The United States military has long had a recruitment problem. And you recently had the Secretary of War, Hegseth, come out saying, oh, outside of us it being difficult to recruit, too many Americans are too fat, right? And people laugh at these things, but what that says is that people in the U.S. also don't have an appetite for war. And because people in the U.S. don't have an appetite for war, it is my view that one of the reasons Trump is building up this armada and stuff is because he wants it to be a situation where Venezuela attacks the U.S. so then they can come into the news and say, hey, our soldiers were attacked, because that is how they can trump up support for any sort of war in Venezuela. Otherwise, it is just not there. And I also don't think it is beyond the Trump administration to want to go in, especially given who has the ears of the president, which is a lot of those Republicans in Florida. But I also think that they are going to heavily underestimate the region. And I think that if a hot war were to happen, I think that that is when people will start having these conversations about unity in much more organizational and systematic ways as well.
Well, I think this is...
And if I may add to that, Steve, what we don't as well know, because, I'm not a military expert. We're not party to the discussions of what actually has happened, right? We don't know how effective these Russian military anti-aircraft systems and other systems that have been sent to Venezuela, how effective they are, right? And we know that the United States can inflict tremendous damage, right? Okay? But they're going to be very vulnerable to people going back home in body bags, right? Okay? Planes being shot down and so on and so forth. And a last point I'd like to make, and we're coming back to this point, we're talking about how do we rebuild this idea of Caribbean unity and so forth, right? Getting back to this popular idea. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that Venezuela has had this resistance capacity, but more importantly, that Cuba has been able to resist for over 60 years, right? Okay? Because they had whatever the twists and turns, right? And mistakes and errors they've made, right? Okay? We can argue, right? They've had a popularly based revolution that delivered fundamental things. Yes, these things are under attack because of the U.S. imperial siege, right? But they've delivered fundamental things to the Cuban people, right? And they've united the nation around what were historical aspirations that went back to the 19th century. That's what I think we need in the Caribbean, right? The comprador elites are too tied into the international circuits of capitals, the status, the privilege, the potential of, really, aggrandizing themselves further, right? In the world, to actually provide the kind of leadership, okay, and the vehicle to bring about the kind of sovereignty, self-determination we believe in, right? And that's why we need to have, radical democratic popular sovereignty movements in the Caribbean rooted in the people.
Mm-hmm. Tony, you have some comments?
The ends game in this, and we've seen scorched earth strategies, and how that played out in Libya, how that played out in Syria, how that played out in Iraq, and when you have these factions, militant factions on the ground, armed, what can happen to those societies? And I worry if we have that intervention, where all the intervention, not boots on the ground, that's missiles, drones, without people on the ground, blowing up assets, killing people, taking out societies, taking out governance. What will happen not only in Venezuela, but to the Caribbean? I mean, we saw the migration that happened just with this economic hardship. And then think of the end game. This is, as the news is now pointing out, Cuba seems to be the end game. And Venezuela is in the path of getting Cuba out, right? So what happens if you destroy two big countries like that, Cuba and Venezuela, leave scorched earth? What happens to the islands in the Caribbean around them with migrants, with the challenges? So if CARICOM isn't thinking about this and strategizing around it, then what is CARICOM thinking about?
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is what kinds of weapons are these leaders facing? I mean, you ask yourself, are these decisions rational? And if not, what kind of leverage is American or the government in the States using on them? And we know the economic issues around tariffs, but we also know the issues around the very human thing that many people in the Caribbean like, that U.S. visa, and how powerful a weapon that is, especially in getting, you don't want to be a head of state, where suddenly your people are cut off from that, and many governments in the Caribbean have strong foot soldiers in the U.S. Who oftentimes finance their elections. So you don't want to jeopardize their incomes. So it's a really difficult balancing act. So it's easy to cast aspersions and decisions to make, right? But as somebody said, we don't know what the background conversations are about. But it does need us as people in the Caribbean thinking about these things to help give our politicians some backbone, to show up some sense of support and help them with their arguments, either amongst themselves or with their own population or in talking to Washington. Because, as you say, not many people out there thinking differently. Everybody's responding.
Yeah.
So I really worry about what the end game can be. I remember, and I mentioned the impact of war on fuel. I remember during the first and second Gulf Wars, the refinery at Pointe-a-Pierre made huge amounts of money because the U.S. military couldn't get enough aviation fuel to keep their jets flying. So it is, really and truly, if you're planning for a war, right, what will that do to fuel prices in the Caribbean? The Caribbean already has some of the highest fuel prices in the world. And that's why even before Chavez, long before Chavez, in the 1990s, PDVSA approached the Trinidad government and said to the Trinidad government, let's help break the monopoly of the Essos, Exxons, and the Shells in the Caribbean. Because these small islands had a single import terminal. There wasn't enough space to build two terminals because there was enough demand, and the owner of the terminal controlled the price. And PDVSA came to the Trinidad government and said, let's break this monopoly. We will supply you with oil for you to refine at the refinery. We will put the capital to build an alternate terminal, and you will use your relationships with CARICOM to get the governments in those countries to give you space to build those terminals. And we'll compete with those northerners and bring cheaper fuel prices to the Caribbean. That's long before Petrocaribbean. This is Venezuela thinking strategically about their neighbors and their markets. Why wouldn't Venezuela dominate the Caribbean market for fuels? Or Trinidad? So there's been that, there's been opportunities there, but we never had the will or the ability to think, as Tamanisha said, think without depending on northern capital and the capital markets outside of the region. So it's rethinking the Caribbean, rethinking the economics, rethinking our independence, what needs to happen. And it was the same with telecoms. For a long time, the only part of the world that cable and wireless was making money was in the Caribbean. And we kept cable and wireless afloat, and we still do, or the successor companies. We had some of the highest fuel prices and the highest telecoms prices in the world, and the highest debt per capita in the world. And it wasn't coincidental. It's just because we didn't get our act together and fix those problems, which we could do, and we could still do.
Our history is one of mercantile relations. The commission agents of the colonial times are the business, czars in import. Everybody's import bill is too high. Trinidad spends about $8 billion a year for importing food alone. I'm talking about U.S. So only Guyana is feeding itself, can feed itself in the Caribbean. If there is, we are wrapping up now, but if there is something to come out of this moment, I think our best option is if the U.S. turns back. I doubt they would want to turn back without some claim to some kind of success. And that's why I'm afraid that the option they take might either be as has already been reported by Venezuela, whether I don't know the evidence or not, that there was a conspiracy to create a false flag incident to say that Venezuela has attacked in order to attack. That's one possibility. The other is to claim, and I think I heard Trump say that he's going to bomb some transshipment facilities and drug facilities, and you terrorize people with that and say we've done it, like in Iran. You bomb the nuclear facilities, you're gone, because I can't see that land war. As we're told that the appetite is not there. The support for this, they're only now talking about an increase in support among the MAGA crowd, much less Americans as a whole, because even the MAGA crowd did not support this. I think there's a very good chance that they do not want to go on land in Venezuela. Maybe he did give instructions to the CIA to send people. If you can make some mischief, capture, kill. If the $50 million has not convinced anybody to give up Maduro yet. So that's still there. So if there's anything, I think, to come out of this, it is for us to recognize the danger in which we have put ourselves by our inattention to the requirement to become genuinely independent. We cannot depend on the U.S. to provide security for us on our own shores, in our own land. We have to find that money and spend it. I see there's a news story today about the U.S. buying a vessel for Trinidad and Tobago, but they're saying that vessel might have to do for not patrols, but for floods and so on. I don't know. That's what was put in the procurement note. We have to take responsibility for the place, and because we are small, we have Latin America. This is the same experience. These are the same people. We've come out of the same experience. We have to deal with the language problem. We have to transform the education system. We have to transform the political systems that are all top-down for us to get to that point of having a genuine stake. I think it's so... These... the communities that support integration are up against people, so many people with the transactional politics they're engaged in, which is, I want my visa. I mean, you can threaten a whole country with threatening a visa. And the Trump is doing that all over the Caribbean. They're doing that. And people are afraid. So the opportunity is this moment, in the crisis, to rediscover our own sense of self-identity, address those questions, reach out and build alliances, and give voice to everyone who stands for this. Because people tend to believe there are just a few. People have gone into retreat, but it doesn't mean that they've necessarily changed their minds. They are there, they're waiting to hear that it's okay to speak, because there is fear. And the more that you can terrify people that they will lose something, they may not get a job, they may be seen to be as, the enemy. No. The resources are so few. Everybody's in an economic problem. Every country is in debt. Every jobs are a challenge. And so individuals are looking after themselves. So to the extent that we could build some form of awareness and a movement and bring these issues and communicate more across boundaries within your countries and across, and build some form of solidarity on the work that has already been done. There's so much work that went on before the independence period and into as the Caribbean prepared itself for independence on some kind of basis where you can determine your own future on your own terms. That work, it wasn't just the Grenada Revolution. I think the fall of the Berlin Wall, it affected the movements across the region. And a lot of people just gave up and they went, a lot went to the States, they went to jobs and so on. And this moment reminds us of why we can't allow that, because it is a dangerous moment. Because the end game, I don't think the end game is, I don't think it's Cuba. I think Cuba is in the crosshairs, but the end game is total domination. And this is why, you know, there is no shame that the U.S. is expressing in announcing that we are supporting this candidate, we are putting money behind this candidate, releasing that convicted drug trafficker. And in an environment when you're fighting drugs, and the irony doesn't, there's not even an attempt to cover up that excuse. And so we are going into a season where there is going to be active undermining of democratic systems, of elections, brazen, and they will be brazen because the U.S. is clear in saying what their mission is, and their mission is hemispheric control for global domination. So this is not a time to be asleep. Yeah. Anybody has some last words they'd like to offer?
No, I think you summed it up quite well. This is not a time to be asleep. This is a time to, not just to awaken the Caribbean, but to awaken the long and powerful intellectual history of struggle, of resistance, as well as a long history of struggle that goes back to the very resistance of indigenous resistance to colonialism, the massive slavery rebellions that took place, and to the struggle for independence.
Okay. So thank you very much for viewing, and I look forward to talking in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure. Take care. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.